Hey guys, we're live. Welcome to the first episode of Breakfast and Bible. Um, I did bring breakfast. I don't know if I'll be able to eat it and talk at the same time. I didn't really think that through, but I did bring breakfast, and I hope you guys have good breakfast. Um, I'm gonna wait a few seconds to see if anybody is fashionably late, um, and we will pray and get started with our topic today. Um, right now, we're on YouTube and on Facebook. if you're on Facebook, I pinned a link at the top. You'll have to let StreamYard have permission to see your name if you comment. If you don't want to give them permission, I totally understand. You'll just show up as Facebook user. So if I see your comment, then I'll just respond to you as Facebook user. If you're on YouTube, you should be able to use the live chat as usual, and it should just show up normally. That's what I've been told. This is my first time using StreamYard or doing a live, so if things are a little buggy, bear with me. But I'm super excited, and I'm glad you guys could join. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pray us in so that we can invite the Holy Spirit as we study. And I'm going to pray over my food and your food, if you have food. And feel free to comment in the chat throughout the stream. Father, thank you for this opportunity and the technology to be able to do this. I pray that you will be in our presence as we read about what it means to be a woman of God, specifically today talking about why you created us and what our purpose is. I pray that you remove any biases that we may have, and that you will open our eyes and our hearts to your desires. I also pray over the lovely food that we may be partaking in as we do this study. In your son, Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys. So at the very beginning, I did kind of a brief preview of what my notes looked like. I cannot do them live for you guys because it just takes way too long. It is just absolutely impossible. It took me about 3 hours to actually do this. So I'm just going to show you the finished products on camera, and we'll walk through it. Today, we're going to talk about the creation and purpose of woman. I figured if we're doing a series on what it means to be a godly woman, we should start at the very beginning, which is why we were created and for what purpose. So today we're going to be going over Genesis 1, verse 27, and Genesis 2, verses 18 through 23. That's what I studied, and I linked that on social media beforehand so that you guys could also study it ahead of time, so that you guys would be, prepared for whatever it is that we talk about. So I am going to read it just because these are very short verses. So in Genesis 1, chapter 27, it says, "So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." And then in Genesis 2, starting in verse 18, it says, "Adonai, God said, 'It isn't good that the person should be alone. I will make for him a companion suitable for helping him.' So from the ground, Adonai, God, formed from every wild animal and every bird that flies in the air, and he brought them to the person to see what he would call them. Whatever the person would call each living creature, that would be its name. So the person gave names to all the livestock, to the birds in the air, and to every wild animal. But for Adam, there was not found a companion suitable for helping him. Then God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the person, and while he was sleeping, he took one of his ribs and closed up the place from which he took it with flesh. The rib which Adonai God had taken from the person, he made a woman person, and he brought her to the man person. The man person said, 'At last, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She is to be called woman, because she was taken out of man.'" And then it continues on, which really goes more into marriage, which we're going to talk about later in the series. So I'm not going to continue into that. But I thought there were a couple of interesting points to discuss in this initial creation of woman, well, man and woman, but specifically woman. So in the beginning, it talks about the fact that both male and female are created in the image of God. And when I first read through this, I had to ask myself, does it mean that man was created in the image of God, or both man and woman. And so I did a little bit of digging into the terminology. Um, when I study the word, I like to use the interlinear version of a Bible. An interlinear version, it will show you the original version. So in this case, it would be Hebrew because we're in the Old Testament. And you can then look up the words that are being translated into English. And it helps you to understand what the author might have meant or what translators might have glossed over. So for this particular study, I ended up looking up, I think, about 4 different words. One was the image. What does it mean to be created in the image? And I also looked up this word that in the translation I'm reading, which is the Christian Jewish Bible. It's translated as humankind. In a lot of translations, you will see it translated as man or mankind. And so I wanted to look up that word and see what is that. I didn't actually write it in a big block like this one. We're going to come back to this. This is image. But I did write further down, highlighted here, the word that was translated to humankind. And it is, I believe it's pronounced ish or ish. And there is a feminine corresponding version of it, which is isha. And it means, actually, I did that wrong. Sorry. We will get to ish and isha, which comes up later and at the bottom here with male and female. But actually, the word that is translated as humankind is Adam. Adam's name, Adam. And so one of the first questions I had was, did it mean Adam himself? Like he created Adam in his image? But the word Adam throughout the Bible is used both to reference Adam, the person, and Adam meaning mankind. That's also the word for mankind, which is a little confusing. And then later, as you get into it, you will start to see this dichotomy of the Ish and the Isha. Ish meaning man and Isha meaning woman specifically. And so that's where I kind of started to study because I wanted to get a better idea of when it's talking about mankind as a whole versus man like men and woman like women. And so as I went through it, I was just trying to determine whether or not, yes, it is related to all of all of mankind, including womankind, or if it was just saying that man was created in God's image. Now, regardless of how you see it yourself, because I encourage all people to research for themselves, I do believe that this first word, humankind, is a correct translation, and that it means that God created both male and female in his image. But if you don't agree with that, that's fine. Either way, if you go down the entire story, if you assume he only created man in his image, he then created woman in man's image, which would also be the image of God. So either way, woman was also created in the image of God. So then I went to look up the word that is translated as image. I'm not really positive how to pronounce this one, so I'm not going to go there. But if you want to check it out, it is in Strong's H6754. That is the way you can reference it if you look into the Strong's Concordance, which will define the original Hebrew or Greek words from the Bible. And so it's roughly defined as image. And one thing that I thought was interesting in the definition was some of this was kind of weird, like images of tumors, mice, heathen gods. Like I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. But I guess in the sense that they used to make images or idols, right? They would make representations or replicas that were supposed to embody these pagan gods. And I guess that's kind of where the phrase images come from. It's a replication of something. But it also talks about the likeness or the resemblance of, and it talks about being in the semblance of. And the root word I thought was interesting because the root word means to shade or a phantom or an illusion, kind of like almost like a ghost of something, I guess. But I thought all of these were interesting in that it brings us back to this idea that we were created to resemble our creator. We're not exactly like our creator, which I guess alludes to this idea of being a ghost of or a phantom of, um, or like a shell of, because we're not exactly like the creator, but we were created in the image of. And I think that's important to remember and an important place to start, because when you are for God to have created us in his image, not only is that a high expectation, but it's also a high value, right? Like if I were creating something and I created it in someone else's image, then I don't necessarily care what, you know, people think of it or what happens with it. But if it has my name on it, if it's something that I'm producing or people are going to associate with me, then I'm going to take a lot more pride and a lot more care in it in general. And I think that that statement that we were created in his image is very profound in that regard. And so that was the first thing that I thought was particularly interesting in the study. Now, of course, it goes on into Genesis chapter 2, where things start to get a little bit more interesting. So in Genesis chapter 2, there were a couple of things that I really wanted to unpack. And a lot of it just came from verse 18, where, God says that it's not good for man to be alone. And that's why he's creating a woman, or why he will eventually create a woman. And so I wanted to talk about this idea of it not being good to be alone, because this is the first time God says something's not good, right? We're in the garden, everything is perfect. It's, before sin has entered the world, and this one thing is not good. Then I want to talk about this word. In the translation I read you, it reads companion. If you're reading another translation, you probably see the word helper. You may see the word helpmeet. There are lots of different words that go there. And that word has a lot to do with how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive women in general. And I do want to touch on that word because it has been, I would say, grossly misconstrued. And then I kind of wanted to talk about how this relates to what it means to be a woman. That's where we'll summarize and finish up. So first, let's talk about being alone. One of the things that I've often heard, and we'll probably come back to this topic as we get into the concept of like relationships and dating and things like that. But a lot of times people use this not being alone thing as a push for why people are supposed to be married. And I often wonder if that's really what God meant when he said it's not good for man to be alone, that he had to be married, or if it was, the context is like man was alone, like not just like, oh, you're lonely because you don't have a partner or lonely because you don't have someone to date, but like there wasn't anybody there. He didn't have a homeboy, he didn't have a parent. I mean, he had God, but like he didn't have like physical parents. Like it was just him by himself with nobody. And so I wanted to look up this word alone. And it says that it means by itself, besides, apart, separation, and then parts, and basically being, separate or disjoint or whatever. And so one of the things that I did want to touch on here is that I think that, when we look at it, I don't think even though God did create specifically a woman, and I do think there's a reason God created a woman to, remedy Adam's aloneness. I don't think that was the only purpose. I don't think that, because if you go into 1 Corinthians 7, you have a whole verse or a whole chapter that talks about singleness. and singleness being okay. So I don't necessarily think that the it is not good that man be alone is specifically tied to the marriage aspect that comes in later. But I do think that there is something that woman provides man and man provides woman that is good, that is complete. That is how God created his design. And so I think dwelling on that piece is important, because it's way more complex than just simply, I guess, meets the eye, the way people kind of skim over it in, you know, in church. And so in doing so, I wanted to talk about why it's bad to be alone. And a lot of the things that I listed out are not just for man, they're also for us as women. When you're alone, sometimes you get bored. Life becomes really difficult. I can tell you this as a short person. It is so hard to reach high shelves and things. I'm like, I need somebody to come reach this for me. Or, if you're sick or something like that, you're always scared. Like, what if something happens? No one's here to like help me or to, call 911 or whatever. So a lot of things in life are just more difficult, when you're alone. And of course, in today's society, salaries, when you're alone, you only got one salary. Together, you get two salaries. Another thing, this being specific to the male and female dynamic of creation, is reproduction. Can't really get more people if you only have men or if you only have women. Another thing I wrote was the singular point of view or perspective. A lot of times, just being different, be it being male and female or being from a different class or being from a different race, we bring in different perspectives that help us round out reality, help us figure out things, help us to grow and things like that, which ties into the lack of diversity that I wrote. And then also I wrote down weakness because in general, when you're alone, it's easy to attack you. The more people that are around, the less likely an attack will occur. For instance, if you were out camping and there was like 20 of you, one bear is not going to roll up on 20 human beings. He's probably going to go on about his business. But if you're out there in the woods by yourself, then, that's probably not good. He might take his chances. And so there's definitely a lot of bad that comes from being alone. And again, this is not necessarily just tied to relationships in terms of romantic relationships. It's just generally, it's not good to be a singular unit. And so I also listed here, I'm not sure if it's showing up on camera, Ecclesiastes 4 verses 8 through 12. If you want some extra reading, it goes over why it's not good for man to be alone. So essentially, woman was created so that man would not be alone. And the question we get from here is, why woman? And going into this concept of the helpmate, because it says she was created to be a helpmate. And that is where it gets really interesting. So, as I said, in my translation, it says companion. Most people are familiar with the phrase helpmate or helpmeet, which is more prominent in the King James Version. I went through and actually read a ton of different versions to see what each version uses here, because this is the word that really turns us into, housewives and like servants and all this other stuff, because we're supposed to be the helper and this idea of being the help. And usually the help ends up doing what the person does not want to do. That's generally how things work. And so primarily it is, translated as helper. A lot of the newer translations, the NASB, the NIV, the NLT, things like that do helper. I did find one translation, the ISV. I've never heard of the ISV. I've never read the ISV, but it actually translated it as authority, which that reads completely different to say, that he's going to make a partner, or he's going to make an authority for man. Like that, I was like, oh wow, I don't know who was translating that, but that seems very, very wildly different than the other translations. And then some will go to companion or partner. And so I thought it was interesting, but I decided to look up the word because that is the important thing. Now, the word is roughly defined as helper. You look it up in the concordance, it does in fact mean helper, which is why it's most often translated as helper. What is interesting, however, is if you actually go through and you read where this word also appears in the Bible. So to get a feel of how it's being used, each time we say help, what do we mean? Like what kind of help? So I went through and I looked at some of the verses where this word appears and is translated help, the same way it is here in Genesis. And I'm not going to read all of them because I didn't find them in advance to read to you, but I do want to read a few of them just to give you a biblical perspective before I state my own opinions on it. So if you go into Exodus chapter 18, verse 4, it says, the name of the other was Eliezer, which means my God helps, because the God of my father helped me by rescuing me from Pharaoh's sword. So in this verse, the word help, because the God of my father helped me, that is the same word that is translated in Genesis 2 to me, that comes out as helper or helpmeet, saying what woman will be. You can also find similar things in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 7, in Psalms chapters 115, verse 9, as well as chapter 121, verse 2, and in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 5, and in Daniel chapter 11, verse 34. These all have the same thing in common. They all reference God helping Israel, which I found to be very interesting. They're all about how God is basically saving Israel from some sort of disaster or being the help that they need in their time of need. And I thought that was interesting because from our modern perspective and from the way things have gone, we typically read it in Genesis and it's like, oh yeah, a woman is a helper. She's supposed to cook and clean and all of these domestic things. But when you actually follow that word through the Bible, it seems to be more strong in terms of strength and helping in times of need and things like that. It definitely seems a little bit more interesting than washing the dishes, I will say. And that kind of ties into what happens next in the narrative, which I find interesting, is that Eve is created from Adam's rib. Now, Adam was created from the dust. Okay, we read that in Genesis 2, verse 7. We didn't go over that, but Adam was created from the dust of the ground. So when God got ready to create Eve, why didn't he create Eve from the dust of the ground? Instead, he pulls out a rib from Adam's side to create her. Now, one could argue it's to link them, to make them one flesh, literally. But I think it's a lot more than that. Everything God does is a vision of something. It is symbolic of something. It is spiritual and physical. And so I asked myself, what is the significance of your ribs? Like, what is the purpose of your ribs? What does it mean to take a rib out? Like, if I were to get injured and they were to take a rib from me, what would happen? Like, how would that affect me as a person? And why do I need that rib? So your ribs are bones in your body. Like, this is I forgot what this is called, but you have an arm bone, you have your finger bones. But in most cases, the bones in your body are just covered by skin, right? Like there's just skin, maybe a little bit of meat around it. Same thing around my arm. Like to get to my bone, you would have to go through my muscle and my flesh and everything before you got to the bone. And they're generally there for structure to keep your body structured. Your ribs, however, serve a couple of other functions. They're not just there for your posture, and they actually form a protective cage around your vital organs. So there are no organs in my arm, there are no organs in my leg. If someone were to, stab me in the arm and go all the way into my bone, like that would be bad. It would hurt. But as long as I got to the doctor within time, so that I don't bleed to death, it wouldn't really be that bad. Like the damage probably isn't that big of a deal. However, where your ribs are is where your lungs are, and your heart, and your spleen, and all kinds of other organs that you need to breathe and to have your blood flow through your body. I mean, aside from your brain, which it's got all of the most important organs you have. And your ribs serve as a protective cage so that if something happens, if you fall, if somebody attacks you, there is a layer of protection before you get to your ribs. So if you were missing a rib, that would be the weak spot. That would be the perfect place for someone to go in with a knife to stab you, because that is where you are missing protection, right? And I think that's interesting for many, many reasons. One of those reasons we will get into in the next episode when we talk about the fall of mankind and what happened to woman thereafter. But skipping ahead just a little bit, you will notice, if you are familiar with the story of the fall in Genesis 3, that the serpent does not go to Adam. He doesn't go to Adam to try to cause destruction. He goes directly to Eve, which is his weak spot, because she came from his rib. I do see the comment from Sia. Thank you. Ribs also stretch so that you can breathe. So made from a very precious part. You are absolutely correct. I did also see when I was studying ribs that it has something to do with how you breathe, and it helps make breathing easier. So you bring up a great point. Thank you for that. It is a very precious part of the body. It is very important, and it does have some semblance of protection and going back to this idea of helping and protecting and all of that. And I think it's also a need, like you need your ribs. Like I cannot imagine if you were like, I don't think you can just have ribs. I mean, maybe like one rib, but like your entire rib cage, you need them to live and to function. And so I think it's interesting because it seems to me to signify that Adam needed Eve. And by creating Eve from Adam, as opposed to creating her from the dust, it signified that Eve needed Adam. And we see this logic in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 11, where it talks about the fact that men and women are not independent of each other, that you need men to get women, you need women to get men. We're not independent. We have to act together. And so I thought it was interesting because I've never really heard a lot of people stop to dwell on that. I don't know. I just thought it was something beautiful in that it's a very important part of the body that she came out of. And then I did make a note to myself here in this little box that verse 23 of Genesis chapter 2 is where we first start getting this differentiation for male and female. If you see the word man anytime before this, it is actually Adam, which could be mankind or could be referencing Adam himself. But after that, you'll start to see distinctions between male and female. And so overall, I think that these verses give us a very beautiful picture of the creation of woman, that we were created as special people, special beings, that we were created in the image of God, that we are needed, and that it's more than just the help status that we think of as like a maid, but it is definitely way more protective, way more strong, and it has a lot more to do with, as Sia mentioned, breathing, right? Like there's a lot more to this role of being a helper than people often go into. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this study. So I don't want to get long winded. If anyone has any comments, feel free to put them in the chat. If you had any thoughts as you were reading it, or anything that you thought should be mentioned that I didn't mention already. The next episode will be not next Sunday, but the Sunday after that. And we'll be talking about the fall and what happened to woman's status and her role after the fall. So for that, I would say read Genesis 3. There are some other verses that go along with that in the New Testament. I will post them when I post to social media so that you can also look along. And yeah, I think that is all for today. Thank you guys for joining. I hope you guys will show up again. It's been really fun. This whole live stream thing has been an interesting experience. It's a lot more nerve-wracking than pre-recorded things. But as always, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram, here on YouTube, or Facebook. Let me know your thoughts, any topics that you want to discuss in the series. And don't forget to like, subscribe, all of that stuff so you can get notified when we're going to be having a live. And I will see you guys 2 Sundays from now.